They said no white man ever survived meeting the Apache Queen, until a lone cowboy stumbled into her canyon and disappeared from the world he once knew. The stories had been whispered around campfires for generations, men riding into the deep red canyons, only their horses returning saddles, empty eyes wide with terror, and no trace of the riders themselves. Blood-stained trails, overturned gear, and the occasional skeleton bleached by the sun served as grim reminders of the fate that awaited anyone who dared tread too close to the Apache lands. James Jim Carter had heard the stories, of course, but desperation drowned caution. A bullet wound seared his shoulder, each movement sending sharp jabs of pain through his chest. The bounty hunters on his trail were ruthless and relentless, closing the distance with every passing hour. His horse, a stubborn mare named Copper, carried him more than he rode her, stumbling through the uneven, jagged path that led into the canyon. Sweat burned his eyes, dust coated his lips, and his muscles screamed in protest with each step. The desert sun bore down on him like a merciless judge, and yet he pressed on, guided by a mix of sheer will and the faint hope that salvation, if it existed, lay somewhere beyond those looming cliffs. The canyon walls rose like silent sentinels, their deep crimson faces reflecting the harsh morning light. The wind whipped through the crevices, carrying with it the dry scent of sagebrush and the faint echo of a past long buried in the rocky folds. Jim's thoughts were chaotic. Part of him feared that the stories were true, that stepping foot into this canyon was a ticket to oblivion. Another part, the smaller, stubborn part, clung to a dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, the legends were exaggerated. And then he saw her. Ayani, the Apache Queen. Not yet fully revealed, but her presence was felt a tangible weight that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. She was the living embodiment of every whispered warning, beautiful, deadly, and commanding a respect that transcended fear. The Apache knew her as a warrior, a leader, a strategist. Outsiders told tales of her ruthlessness and unflinching justice. Jim had no time to marvel, though his body teetered on the edge of collapse, and every heartbeat reminded him of the bullet lodged in his shoulder and the hunters closing in from behind. The canyon seemed endless, a labyrinth of stone and shadow, each turn a potential death trap. Copper's hooves struck the hard rock with a rhythmic clatter, echoing against the canyon walls like an anxious drumbeat. Jim's vision blurred as fatigue, fever, and the desert heat took their toll. The wind's howl carried an almost musical yet terrifying cadence, twisting through the narrow crevices and playing on his nerves. He gritted his teeth and forced himself onward, each step a battle against his own failing body. Despite the danger and his pain, there was something hypnotic about the canyon. The way the dawn light flickered across the cliff faces, painting them in shades of gold and blood red, and the way the shadows seemed to shift and sway like silent watchers. Jim felt it deep in his chest, a mixture of awe and dread, a recognition that he had entered a place where stories and reality blurred, where legend walked alongside flesh and bone. Ayani's gaze would find him soon enough, and he knew, in that creeping dread that chilled even his sun-baked skin, that the moment of truth was inevitable. Would he survive, or would the canyon claim him like so many before? The answer remained as hidden as the trails winding through the cliffs, teasing him with every uneven step, every echoing gust of wind. He was alone, wounded, hunted, but somehow drawn forward, as if the canyon itself had a purpose for him. And somewhere deep in the shadows of the canyon, a presence waited, a figure of strength, intelligence, and authority, ready to decide whether James Carter would be another cautionary tale or the first white man to walk out alive, forever changed. Ayani had seen many travelers stumble through the canyon, most of them never making it past the first bend. But when she spotted James Carter crumpled against the red stone, his horse pacing nervously nearby, she knew this one was different. His white shirt was soaked in blood, the bullet wound in his shoulder dark and ominous, and yet there was a resilience in the set of his jaw that drew her attention. Without hesitation, she leapt down from the ridge, her movements fluid, and silent, a predator moving with purpose and control. The wind tugged at her dark braids, carrying the scent of sage as she knelt beside him, assessing the injuries with quick, precise hands. "Stay still," she commanded softly, her voice firm but not unkind. Jim's eyes fluttered open, clouded with fever and shock. He tried to speak, but the words came out as a rough whisper. Ayani's keen gaze took in every detail, the shallow breathing, the pallor of his skin, the faint tremor in his hands. She set aside her bow and dagger, focusing entirely on stabilizing him. With practiced efficiency, she tore strips from a clean hide, soaking them in water and applying crushed desert herbs she carried in a small pouch. The pungent aroma of sage mixed with the sweet medicinal smell of desert flowers, cutting through the heat and dust that clung to his body. She worked silently, her fingers steady and sure as she cleaned the wound and wrapped it carefully. Jim flinched at first, then relaxed under her touch, sensing both authority and care. It was a delicate balance, life and death intertwined in a single moment. Ayani's eyes never left his, dark and penetrating, weighing him, reading him as one would read the patterns in the canyon walls. There was intelligence there, an understanding that went beyond mere survival instinct, and it made her pause. He wasn't like the others, those who had come seeking to exploit, steal, or claim her people's land. "You are different," she murmured, not as a question but as an observation. Jim, despite his pain, managed a faint nod, unsure whether to trust this stranger in the shadows of her canyon. For Ayani, trust was not given lightly. Her people's survival depended on careful judgment, on knowing who could be allowed to live among them, even temporarily. And here, kneeling beside her in the flickering firelight, Jim's honesty and quiet courage shone through. The warmth of the small shelter contrasted sharply with the harsh canyon beyond. Fur-covered mats lined the floor, and woven blankets adorned the walls, each a testament to her people's craftsmanship. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows across Ayani's face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the intense focus in her eyes. Jim could feel the heat of the flames and the subtle calming scent of sage wrapping around him, grounding him despite the pain that still throbbed in his shoulder. "You must understand our ways," Ayani said, her tone shifting from healer to teacher. "The canyon is our home. Every action has consequence. Every lie, every rash decision can cost lives." Jim listened intently, realizing that this was more than a lecture. It was an introduction to a code, a living law that demanded respect. Ayani's words were layered with expectation, challenging him to show honesty, courage, and humility. As the hours passed, a fragile connection began to form. Jim sensed that Ayani was not only evaluating his survival skills, but also his character, his integrity. And she in turn was seeing in him something rare, someone who could understand, who could endure, who might emerge from the canyon changed but not broken. The tension between them was subtle, a quiet electricity that neither fully acknowledged but both felt. The canyon outside might have been filled with danger, but inside that small shelter, a new kind of challenge was taking shape, one of trust, respect, and the beginnings of an unlikely alliance. By the time the first rays of sun filtered through the entrance, Jim's wound had been stabilized, and his breathing had eased. He met Ayani's gaze fully for the first time, sensing the unspoken weight of her judgment. She had saved him, yes, but she had also shown him a glimpse of what it meant to be worthy of survival in her world. And somewhere deep in the quiet beneath the firelight and the smell of sage, a seed of mutual respect, and perhaps something more had been planted. The canyon was rarely silent, but tonight the stillness was different, thick with anticipation and danger. Ayani's sharp ears caught the distant thrum of hooves, a rhythm that set her pulse racing just slightly faster than the firelight flickering across the shelter. The bounty hunters had tracked Jim this far. They were close, too close. Every instinct honed over years of leading her people warned her that any misstep could cost lives. She moved with quiet precision, signaling Jim to stay low. "Do not make a sound," she whispered, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Jim's heart pounded against his ribs, each beat echoing the urgency in the canyon around them. His breathing slowed, only slightly, as he realized the stakes discovery would mean death not just for him, but for everyone in the camp. Ayani crouched beside him, their shoulders brushing a deliberate closeness that had a purpose beyond comfort. Her dark eyes met his sharp and calculating, yet softened by an unspoken trust. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Jim would not be himself. Ayani had dressed him in the garments of her women loose skirts, a shawl and a wide scarf to hide his features. He felt ridiculous, exposed, and vulnerable, yet somehow safer than he had in days. "Move carefully," Ayani instructed. "I will lead you, follow. If they question you, do not speak. I will translate everything for you." Her hands adjusted the shawl around his shoulders, with precise fingers brushing his skin in a moment that made his pulse jump for reasons beyond fear. Outside, the canyon whispered. The distant clatter of hooves grew louder, punctuated by the snap of a branch or the scrape of boot on stone. Ayani had set traps and misleading trails to confuse the hunters, but the risk remained. Every step they took could reveal Jim's presence, and every shadow seemed to bend with malice. Jim felt the canyon shrink around him, every breath heavy, with the scent of dry earth sage and smoke from the central fire. His senses sharpened in a way he hadn't known. He could each sound and flicker of light amplified in his mind. Inside the shelter, the intimacy between them was almost suffocating, but it was a weapon. Ayani leaned close as she readied the fire to flicker low, positioning their bodies so that any observer would assume familiarity beyond necessity. The closeness, the subtle touch of her hand as she adjusted his scarf, and the way her knee lightly pressed against his leg created a tableau that blended strategy with something undeniably human, a fragile, electric connection forged under threat. Jim felt a surge of warmth, the heat of both fear and admiration coursing through him. The bounty hunters entered the camp in fits and started their flashlights cutting harsh arcs of light through the shadows. Ayani whispered instructions guiding Jim to shift and move with careful timing. Each question they shouted outside the shelter was met with her authoritative, broken English, carefully controlled, projecting the illusion that the wounded man was nowhere to be found. Jim's muscles tensed and relaxed in rhythm with her instructions, each motion deliberate, each heartbeat synchronized to hers. It was an intricate dance of deception, a life and death performance staged in the dim glow of the fire. As the hours passed, Jim's initial embarrassment and fear softened into trust. Ayani's skill, intelligence, and courage became apparent not only in the strategies she deployed, but in the subtle, protective gestures she allowed him to notice. A glance that lingered too long, a hand brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, small human touches that underscored her authority while acknowledging their shared vulnerability. In those moments, amidst danger and shadows, the canyon seemed to disappear, leaving only two people bound by necessity, trust and an emerging respect that neither could ignore. Finally, as the hunters retreated in confusion, Ayani exhaled quietly, her gaze softening. Jim's shoulders sagged in relief, though his pulse still raced. The tension of the night had created something beyond mere survival, a bond forged in fire and shadow, where strategy and instinct met with the nascent stirrings of something profoundly human. Jim realized that he had entered the canyon a hunted man, but under Ayani's guidance, he had survived not only the pursuit but the psychological trials that came with it. And more than that, he felt an unspoken connection to a woman who commanded both fear and admiration, respect, and something deeper, something that neither legend nor law could fully explain. Dawn had barely broken when Ayani signaled to her warriors. The bounty hunters, confident in their pursuit, had settled near the canyon floor, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was no longer as stable as they believed. Ayani's mind moved with precision, every plan a calculated ripple of consequence. She did not seek blood. She did not crave vengeance. Her victory would be measured in their retreat in the humbling of those who had dared to threaten her people. Under the rising sun, Ayani and her warriors quietly sabotaged the intruders' supplies. Water skins were slit, allowing the desert sand to taint what little remained. Grain and dried meat were scattered and trampled into dust. Horses were freed or driven to safe, hidden valleys, leaving the hunters stranded and disoriented. The canyon seemed to hold its breath as the consequences of Ayani's strategy unfolded with silent, devastating efficiency. Each step, each misfortune that befell the hunters was a testament to her cunning and restraint. She wielded intelligence as a weapon sharper than any blade. Jim watched in awe, perched on a rocky outcrop with Copper tethered nearby. He had arrived at the canyon broken and hunted, yet now he understood the depth of Ayani's strength. It was not merely physical. It was the steady, unwavering authority of a leader who could manipulate the environment and outthink enemies without shedding unnecessary blood. Each maneuver demonstrated a harmony of wisdom, courage, and respect for life. For the first time, Jim felt his fear subside, replaced by admiration and a growing respect for the woman who had not only saved him, but orchestrated justice with such precision. As the bounty hunters stumbled through the canyon, confused and humiliated, Jim realized he was no longer a passive participant. He had observed, learned, and followed Ayani's guidance, becoming more than a man merely trying to survive. He understood the subtleties of the land, the tactics employed by her people, and the culture that shaped such strategic minds. This was more than survival. It was initiation into a world governed by honor, intelligence, and the unspoken rules of the Apache. His respect for Ayani deepened, and with it a loyalty that would not waver. The hunters finally conceded their pride, wounded more than their bodies. They left with nothing but their own frustration, a lesson engraved not in scars, but in experience. The canyon returned to its quiet state, but the echoes of their failure lingered like a whispered story. Ayani and Jim sat together by the hidden fire, sharing a moment of respite. The tension of the night had dissolved, leaving space for reflection. Jim could not help but study Ayani, noting the subtle strength in her posture, the calm decisiveness in her eyes, and the way she moved with grace even after hours of orchestrating the canyon's defense. It was a moment of revelation for him. Leadership was not about domination, but about mastery of oneself, of the environment, and of human nature. Ayani had demonstrated that power tempered with wisdom and mercy commanded far more respect than violence ever could. And in that understanding, Jim found his own sense of purpose. No longer merely a fugitive running from death, he became an ally, a student of the land and its people, a man willing to respect and uphold the values that had guided Ayani and her warriors for generations. For the audience, there was satisfaction in the resolution. The threat had been neutralized, justice served, and yet the story had retained its humanity. The hunters were defeated without cruelty, the canyon remained unspoiled, and a bridge was forming between two worlds. Through Jim's eyes, viewers could appreciate not only Ayani's brilliance, but the transformative power of respect, intelligence, and ethical leadership. The canyon, once a place of fear and legend, had become a stage where courage, cunning, and collaboration triumphed over recklessness and brute force. As night settled over the canyon, the fire's warm glow painted flickering patterns across the walls of Ayani's tent. Jim sat beside her, the exhaustion of days spent fleeing, hiding, and surviving finally giving way to a fragile sense of peace. The air was filled with the subtle scent of sage, mingling with the crisp desert night, creating an atmosphere that was both comforting and sacred. Outside, the canyon slept under a blanket of stars, its shadows deep but harmless, now the bounty hunters long gone, and their threats rendered powerless by Ayani's cleverness and unwavering resolve. In that quiet moment, Jim realized how far he had come. He was no longer the hunted man who had stumbled into this canyon days ago. The bullet wound that had once threatened to end his life had healed under Ayani's careful hands, but more importantly, he had been transformed by the lessons he had witnessed. Courage and intelligence had not only preserved his life, but it also safeguarded the lives of the Apache people. Through Ayani's guidance, he had seen how strategy, patience, and wisdom could achieve outcomes far greater than brute force ever could. Ayani, for her part, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and careful assessment. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the strength and dignity that made her a leader respected by her people and feared by outsiders. But behind that formidable exterior was humanity, compassion, and a willingness to trust qualities that had allowed Jim to survive and earn his place in this hidden world. He realized that trust and respect were currencies more valuable than any gold or power the hunters had ever pursued. As they sat together, Jim felt a bond forming, one built on shared experience, mutual reliance, and a newfound understanding of honor. Ayani spoke softly of her people's traditions, the rules that governed the land and its inhabitants, and the delicate balance required to maintain peace and justice in the canyon. Jim listened attentively, appreciating the depth of her wisdom and the careful thought behind every decision she made. The lessons were clear. Courage, integrity, and intelligence could shape destinies, protect communities, and bridge divides between worlds that seemed irreconcilable. The night stretched on, and the intimacy of the moment deepened without words. Jim's respect for Ayani had grown into admiration, and something more subtle but profound began to stir a recognition of shared values and the possibility of connection across the boundaries of culture, past mistakes, and personal history. In that quiet firelight, the canyon was no longer merely a place of danger. It had become a classroom, a refuge, and a space where trust and understanding could flourish. For the audience, the story offered more than adventure. It delivered lessons that resonated beyond the canyon walls. The courage to act rightly, the intelligence to choose strategy over violence, and the honesty to earn trust were qualities that mattered in any era, particularly in the lives of men and women who had faced choices with long-lasting consequences. Jim's journey from fugitive to valued ally and his growing bond with Ayani demonstrated that honor, loyalty, and thoughtful action could transcend differences, whether of culture, history, or circumstance. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, Jim leaned back, watching Ayani's skilled hands weave a small pattern into a leather strap. She glanced at him, a subtle smile touching her lips, one that conveyed both approval and a quiet joy in shared victory. The canyon, once a place of legend and fear, now bore witness to a new tale, one where courage, wisdom, and compassion had triumphed, where trust and respect created bonds stronger than any blade, and where two people from different worlds found harmony and purpose together. Ayani's voice broke the silence. "You belong here. Now," she said softly. Jim nodded, understanding that survival alone was no longer enough. He had earned his place, his loyalty, and perhaps something even deeper. The firelight reflected in his eyes, mirroring the canyon stars, and for the first time in days, he felt truly at home. If the story of Ayani and Jim has inspired you, we invite you to follow Epic Western Stories. Share this tale, like and comment below to explore more stories from the frontier, stories of courage, honor, and the human spirit. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the wild lands of the West.